Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips podcast with your geeky host, Lindsay Wheeler, where we talk about everything from death, preparing for your future through estate planning, life, the occasional breakup, entrepreneurship, general nerdery, and of course travel, snowboard, and always wine. Welcome to Legacy Sips and Tips with your host, Lindsay, and today we have Ben Parrett on to discuss gardening and all things gardening, because life's a garden. Dig it.
Hello.
Thanks for being on.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about gardening. So you have an agricultural degree from UC Davis with your viticulture and Enology. So tell us about how the agricultural aspect of your degree works.
I mean, basically plants are plants, so whether you grow acres of them or just a small raised bed in your backyard, they all require the same few things. So it kind of relates, I guess, to gardening, unless you want to do it on a very large scale, which we could do another talk on that.
So when you get to school to make wine, but you also have this agricultural degree, so what do they teach you there? I mean, you say plants are all the same. Well, what does that even mean?
Well, every plant requires a couple of things, right? They require light, they require some type of medium that they grow in, whether it be soil or hydroponic, any of that thing to support the root structure. And they also require nutrients or food, so it's kind of basic along the course of Mother Nature. It just depends, like I said, on. To me, agriculture is a big scale garden. So you're growing a garden for all the people in the village, whereas a garden that you would have in your backyard would be for you and your family, and maybe some tomatoes to your neighbors or chicken eggs or whatever.
So I think in light of the climate of which we live in here in America, that I think gardening is going to become more important. I think we've kind of strayed from gardening or being in touch with the earth and what that produces. So back in even 50, 60 years ago, people usually had a family garden. Apparently, typically in Europe as well, they still have the family garden in the backyard. And like you said, you might trade with your neighbors if you have a surplus of zucchini or something. So what do you think is going to happen in now coming that people are going to become more in touch with soil, with a garden, and creating more of a homestead for themselves? What would they look for? How does that look?
I mean, I hope so. I hope people become more in touch with nature and soil. It's something I feel that people have lost with our busy schedules and our society in general. Everything's digital, and you get gas and drive to work and drive home. It's not a lot of time to stop and smell the flowers, if you will. And I think that beyond being able to grow some food for yourself, it's very therapeutic, and I think it really has some cool aspects in that category of just relaxing, taking pride in something you've done. You work with nature. I think that's important for people as animals, as humans, that we live on the earth under the sun. Most people don't know how a lot of the food they eat is grown, or even where it comes from. In one of my classes, a girl from Nepal was asking how do peas grow? Is it a stem with a pea on it? And to us that know how peas grow, that's an insane question. But to someone who doesn't have the resources to grow a garden in a frozen climate or in a colder climate like that, it's a great question. And I think
culture doesn't eat that on a day-to-day.
Yeah,
like
all
we
of
do.
the above. And I think just I guess my point is there's a little bit of a disconnect, I think, with whether it be from where you're from or what you're doing, or just in general, if you're too busy or you're not interested. You still need to eat, and you still need to have food that comes from outside in the soil and nature. And so for me, just growing some plants in general, it keeps me happy, it keeps me busy, and it's very enjoyable to share with people something that you grew and that you've nurtured into being a beautiful tomato or zucchini or apple or whatever it is you're interested in growing.
So with that, can anybody grow food? I mean, that's like we've been eating forever. That's why we're all here. We have to eat, and we should be eating fresh produce and stuff, which I think we've gone away from that. Our soil is adulterated. It's been leached. We have factory farming. Like you said, we import a lot of our things. And I think nowadays the shifting in our culture, luckily, is going back to more of that roots of like, we're going to make our own stuff for the village. We're going to be more communal. We're going to make our own family gardens so we can feed ourselves. Tell us more about what your philosophies on that is.
I think to answer your question, like anybody can grow food, yes. I don't think necessarily everyone will be able to grow all the food they need to eat. You need a really big area to do that. People eat a lot of food, per person. But even if you grow one tomato or one pear or whatever you're growing, it's cool that you grew that you can eat what you grew, and you save a couple bucks that day from that. If you're fortunate enough to have a large backyard or a community garden that's multiple acres that you can actually grow a significant amount of produce from, I think that's really cool. And I think that not only does that make team building with your neighbors, if everybody's contributing, and even if it's your own garden in your own large backyard, your neighbors still appreciate, fresh whatever it is for that seasonal, whether it's, person next door that makes jam out of your berries, or you have somebody that, takes all your tomatoes and makes you a nice sauce and gives you back your sauce. So I think there's kind of that pride in the community that kind of goes hand in hand with food. It's a connection. It's something that people enjoy to share. And especially if each person has a specific talent or skill set, whether it's one guy growing the food and the other person cooking it, whatever, that kind of, I think, brings people together. And I think, back to your question again, is I think that, as we go forward, we kind of go backwards. And I think that there's these huge ideas and these huge, technological advances of, for example, fertilizers or tractors where we're not on horses or using, old swords to plow. I think that, going back to that is actually kind of cool. And I think that you'll see as people, evolve and we learn a little bit more, or we're forced to, whether, it's like you said, the soils are ruined because of over farming or over fertilizing or whatever, issues that can happen. I think people will always, even if you grow just a plant on your windowsill, gives you oxygen. It's something that you can water. It's almost like a really slow growing pet. So it's kind of, you get a connection again with your neighbors, with yourself, and with nature. I think that, we'll see how that goes with the big picture, but everybody's capable of growing some type of plant. And
what about, like, if you live in an apartment, you live in an urban setting, you're in a city where we don't have open space or land, how do people then still continue to grow for themselves or have little gardens?
You can grow plants indoors under lights. So, it's, again, you're probably not going to be able to, be self-sufficient in all your grocery needs if you're going to, convert every guest room you have or every, floor, square foot of flooring you have into gardening space with lights above them. But there are little kits you can get on Amazon that are just small little, herb gardens that you can put on your windowsill or in the closet or on the side of your counter in your kitchen or something like that, and still be able to participate in growing your own stuff.
Grow some salad items that grow pretty easily under that kind of stuff, or fresh herbs for your cooking or whatever. So you have at least more fresh things that you've created.
Exactly.
So people with apartments, maybe you have a little balcony. You can grow like a little, I don't even know, what could you grow in there? Tomatoes, you could do some
all kinds
zucchini.
of stuff. Most plants, even if they struggle a little bit, will, their object is to grow. And so even if they don't have great sunlight, or if your window faces north or whatever, the northern hemisphere, for example, you're still going to grow something, and for those people that are like, well, I can't grow anything, I always kill everything. Start with a cactus, start with something easy, something that's not a high maintenance plant. Don't go off the bat thinking you're going to grow, an orchard in your living room and give apples to your whole friends and family, because that's going to be difficult right off the bat. But as you get into more plants, and everybody, myself included, have killed plants in pots, you're going to learn from it, and you're going to not make those mistakes in the future, and you're going to get better at it.
What are kind of the mistakes that people, when they're starting out gardening or creating, trying to grow food for themselves, what is like the biggest red flags or mistakes that you see people doing?
I see people over fertilizing, number one, over watering, number two. People say, oh, my plant's brown, it must need more fertilizer. Well, you've salted your soil, basically, to put it in an easy way to understand. Over fertilization is like, you just overeating. You're not going to feel good. You're not going to be healthy. Overwatering is the same thing. If you constantly have your hands in the water, they're going to be wrinkly, and eventually they're going to be very, very tender and very soft. And plants are no different. They don't want to have wet feet constantly. So I think a lot of people in their minds, they see the plant, they think it needs something, when what they're thinking is probably the opposite of what it's needing. So for example, if your plant's brown, or it's yellowing, or it's shriveling, maybe press pause on your first gut instinct on what you think it is. Take some time to research it, look for other people that have that, look for pictures of those symptoms, whatever you see, and then you can make a bit better informed of a decision, rather than just going, I think it needs water, I think it needs fertilizer, because those two right there are the number one reason plants die.
Interesting. And so do you feel like the technology on our phones and our apps and like Google Lens and all that, you can take a picture of your ailing plant and it'll go, this needs nitrogen, it needs more water, it needs less water?
Yeah. The technology is great. It's at your fingertips. You can look it up. You can Google Lens the picture of your wilted leaf and see what other people say. But at the same time, being a simple thing like, a plant itself, it's not running, it's not moving, it doesn't talk, it's not high maintenance of any kind. It just needs those little specific things. You can pick up the pot. You can feel if it's heavy or light. You can understand, hey, this does need water. I can pick it up with my pinkies. Or, hey, it's heavy, but it's wilting, it's not water. So there's indicators. It doesn't necessarily, you don't have to Google every single moment of, question, but it does help to have technology at our fingertips to be able to see what's going on.
What do you find is more beneficial when you're gardening or growing things on a mass scale versus more in your home?
I think, when you're growing stuff outside and on large scale for agricultural purposes, for feeding the mass people, you have a bigger, I don't know how to put it, but more of a risk, right? You don't want that 10 acres of wheat or barley, whatever you're growing, or, vegetables to die, because now you've let down that many people. When it's your own garden and you don't get a tomato, bummer, but it's not the end of the world.
We can go to the store and get one.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, on the agricultural side of growing things, there's a lot more focus of, pesticides, fertilizers, water use, soil composition. It's more paid attention to, where in most people's backyards, they can go down to Home Depot or some, gardening shop, buy a bag of pre-made soil, dump it in their raised bed, and they're good to go. I personally make my own soil. I like to be able to kind of vary the variables, if that makes sense, or just be more in control of what the plants themselves are growing in and needing. A lot of those companies that are producing, large bags of soil on a huge scale, I'm not going to say they're bad, but it's, obviously they're making money. That's their business. They want to make a profit on a minimal amount of input or cheaper ingredients, for example. So I think, it's great, and I think that's easy for most people, and I think that's what most people are doing. But, if you really are a serious gardener and you start talking to serious gardeners, they're really not growing plants, they're growing soil. And if your soil is healthy, the bugs, the microbes, anything that's in your soil is healthy, your plants will be healthy automatically. It's not something that you need to focus on the plant itself, but a lot of it to me is just basically your soil and again, it's environment too. Temperature of course is important. You're not going to be able to grow pineapple in Alaska, but you could inside. So there's ways around a lot of these types of things.
Interesting. So when you say you make your own soil, so what does that look like? So if someone's starting out, just getting the pre-bought stuff is fine. That's okay. No problem with that. But if you want to elevate your game, if you will, what does that look like if you're going to make your own soil?
So you got to start with an organic matter. So for example, peat moss, sphagnum peat moss is a really good example, very common, easily attainable at any store, gardening store or Home Depot, for example. You need also some sort of colloid, some sort of structural component, whether it be sand, gravel, clay, silt, a mineral, a rock, something from the earth itself to hold that organic matter together. Because if we've all put a piece of wood in the water, it floats, right? So if you have just organic matter in there, it's going to basically wash away. You need something to hold it together. So we talk about sand, silt, clay as our colloids, and loam as kind of the blend of those things. And so as you're making a soil, you want to have a balance between things that hold water, like clay, for example. But if you're going to grow a plant in pure clay, it's never going to dry out. It's going to be too dense. So you have to have some type of porous. So in my soil making, I'll use perlite, which is a volcanic rock, and it allows, it holds water itself around its surface, but it's also very porous in its own right, and it'll allow oxygen in, and it'll allow pore space, so your water can go through it and not just become mud, if you will. So you need drainage, you need organic matter. Also, organic matter breaks down over time, so you need to continue to add organic matter. So if you go outside in Mother Nature and you look at trees dropping their leaves onto the ground at the base of the tree, those leaves will basically decompose and turn back into more soil. So there's kind of a cycle with that. And plants are using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as their carbon fixation to make those actual physical structures of leaves or stems or wood. So that's basically the plant's life cycle, and then they use sunlight to process that in photosynthesis to actually make those substances. So if you think about in a forest, the leaves falling and turning back into duff and turning back into soil and recycling themselves. Same thing in your garden. A lot of people rake up their leaves and they send them off to they put them in the bin outside, and the garbage truck picks them up, and those people compost it and then sell it back to you in these bags at the stores we just talked about. So do that yourself, compost, make a compost pile. Your kitchen scraps are great. You can use those for nutrients and all that type of stuff. I'm not a big fan of using, I don't want to use brand names, but the, miraculous growth product that people use. Those have a lot of metals in them and a lot of things that plants do need, but not consistently over 10 years. Once you over coppered your soil, it's really hard to get those types of things out of there. The heavy metals are really hard. So stick to basic stuff, stick to manures, stick to, green litter, matter, leaves from your yard, and put those on top of your beds. When the rain comes, they'll get wet, they'll sink in and they'll decompose with microbes and other animals that basically are metabolizing them, that live in your little mini forest, if you will, which is what your garden really is. And
so anybody can just make a bed. How would somebody start, I guess, is the question.
I mean, the easiest way I think is to grow in a raised bed, because you don't have that soil saturation. Something above the ground obviously is going to drain to the ground. You're still able to get roots in the ground, but all that above the ground will never actually be waterlogged. So even if you're one of those people that think it needs water, you're not going to saturate that soil to the point where it's going to kill anything. So raised beds are always a good start. You see the experts are growing in the ground, but they're able to manage that soil moisture and that soil nutrition. Also in a raised bed, if you have too much nutrient in there and it's starting to become toxic, because there's levels of deficiency, there's levels perfect, and then there's levels of toxicity, you're able to leach them out. So you can actually add more water. Those water soluble components will actually go lower below the root base and not be toxic to your plant. So it kind of makes it easy. You either, whether it's a pot that you have on your deck or your porch or your balcony, or a raised bed you build out of wood and you fill it with soil, you put a gopher screen underneath so nothing comes from below. There's so many different, we could talk all day about specifics in that, but in general, I think growing something above ground so it can have drainage is an easy start for most people.
And so I think people who are like maybe urban farming or apartment farming and they have a big pot on their deck, they don't understand that these things need drainage. And so when you get a pot, you need to make sure that you drill holes on the bottom so it actually can drain out, because I know people have made that mistake.
Correct.
And I've lifted their pots and I'm like, well, where's your stuff going?
Right.
It's just now sitting in its own stuff.
Yeah, imagine not ever changing a diaper for a baby, right? It's not good. So you want that waste, you want those extra nutrients, you want that extra water or decomposition. And what ends up happening is it gets acidic, and that acidity will actually prevent your uptake of nutrients, because plant roots themselves are making their own acidity to knock off things that are actually bound to the colloids in the soil to uptake. If you have too much acid, they're unable to do that. Your pH is actually too low for actual uptake of nutrients they need. So you've seen, I'm sure a lot of people have seen, when you pick up a pot and there's a bunch of really yellow or brown water down there, that's their waste. So flush that out,
Plant pee.
Plant pee, basically, yeah. So you could take a pot that has those, yellow water coming out of the bottom, flush some water through it, put it in your sink, or if it's outside and it's a huge pot, you can't move it, hose for a while till it runs clear. And then you can kind of start over. It kind of resets that soil structure and those buildups to more of a level that's manageable.
So you're flushing the plant pee, if you will, but are you then flushing all the other nutrients out?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so then you have to supplement from there.
But think about it, if they're unable to uptake it anyway, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So it's better to get the bad out, even if some of the good goes with it, and re-add the good to start over, to reset. So it's a bummer. You spend a couple bucks on whatever bags of manure, or if you're into it, the chemical fertilizers, and it leaches out. However, the soil is now reset. You can add more. And again, like I've been saying, don't keep adding the same stuff. It is nice to kind of change up your nutrient source as well, if you're not composting or you don't have a steady source of manure, for example.
How would people learn this? Like, I feel like, just talking, I'm like, well, that's really overwhelming, and it might be really overwhelming for other people. Like, how do we simplify it? We're already busy as it is. I want to have my little urban garden. I want to have my house garden. I don't have any more bandwidth to deal with this. So how do I make it easy for myself?
Yeah, no, you don't want to overdose yourself on too many hobbies or unnecessarily knowledge in your brain. But just again, you can start with a pot and some store-bought soil. And then those of us with children, they come home with a little sunflower or some kind of a little veggie in a paper cup, with the seed they all planted, and they watch. And when you're young, you're taught that it needs sun and water, and as you get more into it, you understand that there's more to it than that. But simplified, it is basically those things. So, I think you can definitely get overwhelmed in it, but I think that even if you're starting simple, you still get the same satisfaction out of it. So I think people shouldn't worry about that part. It's like anything. You can get really into something, or you could just enjoy some wine, So I don't know. I think that, don't let it scare you that there's a lot to it, because it's really simple. Plants and humans have evolved together for thousands and thousands of years. So I don't think that there's no, reinventing the wheel with it. It is what it is.
So say I'm living in an apartment, and the easiest thing for me would be what? A couple pots for salad? I could make salad, salad buckets. Lettuce grows pretty easy.
Right.
Or
put them in your window. Most people start with indoor plants that are from tropical areas, and they look nice. Or people have flowers that they like because they bloom and they look nice. If you're actually going for edible things, that's cool too, because you can grow herbs and like something like basil, or for example, or rosemary or something along those lines, just in your windowsill. And it's not hard. It doesn't take a lot of time out of your day. Maybe water once a week, check on them. If you're starting to get into like orchids and these things that are a little more complicated, then there's a little more research you need to do. But I think in general, if you're just having fun and you want some greenery in your house, plant some succulents that don't need a lot of water or a lot of light, or plant some ferns, some shade oriented stuff. And these days you'll see on the tags when you buy these plants, they're basic requirements. You'll see a full sun or a half sun or partial shade. They're very clear on what is best, and you can follow those guidelines. And it's not the end of the world if you don't. So don't let that dictate your world either. Just a little bit of light on something that needs full sun, it's still going to grow. It may not be as beautiful as the picture or your vision of what you want, but it'll still grow.
So when you're gardening and you're starting out, what are some of the nutrient requirements that plants like?
So that's a good question. I think when you're looking at fertilizer that you buy at the store, they have 3 numbers on them. The first one being N, the second one being P, and the third being K. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you'll see numbers like 20, 10, 20, or 16, 16, 16. This is the percentage by weight of those molecules, those elements in that product. So the higher the number, the less you need to achieve your goal of nutrients. So in general, N, P, and K are kind of the 3 main nutrients that plants use. There's tons of them. There's about 21 different elements or molecules that the plants actually do need. But those N, P, and K that you see on your fertilizer bags or on your fertilizer, jars or whatever you're buying, basically, in my opinion, if you're going to use those, go with a higher number so you can use less and you're not spending a bunch of money on something that's like a 0.1 or a 0.3. Get the 10, 10, 10. And a lot of fertilizer companies make them easy to use and very balanced, where one's not 50 and the other 2 are 0. Mm-hmm. You can find those, and those are specifically for if you're nitrogen deficient or phosphorus deficient or potassium deficient. But in general, most of them have a well-balanced, recipe, if you will, so your plants will be happy.
So say I've got some houseplants, I've got some non-toxic for animal houseplants, let's be specific. I've got maybe some flowers, maybe I have a little garden outside. What should I be buying, or what would be ideal?
So outside, a lot of people use urea, which is the main ingredient on some of the more popular, chemical fertilizers, the blue stuff that you see people use with little spoons. I think that, is basically a cheap version of nitrogen. So if you're growing stuff inside, so there's nothing wrong with urea. Urea is great, but if you're growing outside, that's easier because you have microbes in the soil. You have heat from the sun. When you're growing inside, you don't have a lot of microbes. Usually your soil is pretty limited. It's a small pot. That will actually be toxic to plants. It takes a couple steps to break down into a usable ammonium. So I think that a lot of people, make the mistake of using outdoor fertilizers on their indoor plants. There's specific indoor plant fertilizers that you can buy that are urea free. And I think that's my number one advice when people ask me, what nitrogen source should I use? So, well, if it's just going to go on your lawn or your tomatoes or your trees, whatever your hedges, use something that's easy and cheap. But if you're going to actually try to keep a plant alive for 50 years because your friend gave it to you or your wife gave it to you, whatever, you're going to want to keep that out of there indoors.
So when you say the 3 that I'm looking for, what would be the percentage I'm looking for when I go buy a fertilizer at Lowe's or something?
Triple 16's a super popular one. So 16N, 16P, 16K, very common, very easy to find. You'll see, like, again, those miracle growth ones are vary in number, and they'll sell you some for tomatoes, they'll sell you some for azaleas, they'll sell you some for Japanese maples. All those nutrients are the same. They're just marketing them in different ratios for different plants that have different needs. But in general, you'll be fine with an all-purpose. Keep the numbers equal, and then you're saving a couple bucks.
So for the average gardener, those specifications are just marketing?
I mean, yes and no. If you're an expert, Japanese maple gardener, you probably want to stick to something that Japanese maples will use. But if you're also growing next to them citrus, and over here you got herbs, and over here you got vegetables, an all-purpose will give all those plants what they need.
So when you are encouraging people to garden or getting into gardening, is there a specific time? Like, I'm not going to be planting things in mid-December. Like, how does that all work?
So yeah, that's a good question. I think that in across the board, there's things you can plant year round. So there are winter crops that are better, or I mean, not necessarily better, but that are able to be planted in the winter. And there's also summer crops that, most people, when they think of gardening, they think of, start in March or April. And then by the time, it starts to get cold and it's fall, spring is gardening, and then fall is the end of gardening. And that's pretty broad and correct for veggies and herbs and stuff like that. But there's stuff like potatoes that grow underground that aren't going to be super affected by a frost. I mean, the tops of them maybe, but there's you think about around the world what they're growing and where. You're not going to, like I think I mentioned earlier, growing pineapple in Alaska, but you can see sugar beets coming out of like Russia, for example, and then you can see, obviously the stuff in the tropics are really easy because it's always warm and nice and raining. Then you can kind of get into the different seasons of, in North America, for example, you can do the winter crops, you can do radishes, you can do lettuces, you can do all kinds of stuff. As long as, really, I think an important part is if you live in an area where it freezes, that's kind of your number one hurdle. So if it's cold, a lot of people will have a little lean-to greenhouse, or they'll keep it, they'll start stuff inside early. So by the time the weather's, cooperating, you can put your plants that are already started outside, rather than planting a seed in June and then trying to harvest it by September. If for example, like here in Nevada, we have a very short growing window. So I think that, you kind of have to think about where you live. And there's a lot of guidelines you'll see, the Western Garden Book is a good example. They have zones. And so it'll say like this, and when you go to the gardening store, you look at the plant and it'll say perfect for zones 6 through 12 or whatever, you know what I mean? And the higher the numbers usually kind of have a warmer climate, like San Diego is kind of the upper end. And, you kind of get to these, tundra, Montana and Wyoming's are kind of more on the 2s and 3s, and Nevada included. So you kind of got to pay attention a little bit on the timing of your stuff, but a lot of stuff you can start inside, and when it's nice, put it outside. And if it gets frosty or you have a cold spell, cover it. People put blankets, people put plastic, people put little, like I said, lean-tos and stuff over them, so you can kind of prolong it and kind of keep your window a little bigger than just what nature's providing.
So for you enjoying gardening, how do you encourage people to garden? Why are you into it that way? And what would you suggest for people who want to get into it?
I mean, I think, again, I really enjoy that being in touch with nature side of gardening. I think that's very important for human beings. We used to all kind of be agricultural folk back in the day. And I think, there still are those people, we call them farmers, but then most people aren't really involved and don't really know. So I encourage people to at least plant something and at least grow something. That way you have a little pride, you have a little of that zen, you can kind of relax. It's nothing heavy. It's not like your cat's starving and you have to feed it this week, you can't go on vacation. Plants are kind of tolerant to your schedule. And so if you forget to water, it'll wilt. It'll show you. It won't die. It'll wilt first. It will die, but it'll wilt first. You water it. Okay, we've accomplished that. So I think that for me, I got into gardening, I think is kind of my, again, my zen, and I take pride in it. I'm very happy when something's successful, when I can share my crop with somebody, whatever it is. You harvest and you share and you eat. And I think that's a really cool connection between people and nature, and people and people. So, you kind of have that sharing, and you also have that in touch with nature side. So I definitely encourage people to plant anything and everything. If you have space, if you don't have space, do a potted plant, grow a big garden if you have the space.
Very cool. So today on our wine talk, we're going to do this again. So today on our wine talk, we have a Sauvignon Blanc from Joel Gott, which is a California, because it is not sourced in just Napa, even though he bottles it and cellared it and Lodi in Napa. But because it is not sourced in Napa from the AVA, it is only California. Fun fact is that Joel Gott's initials are the exact same initials as my friend. So if you ever want to forge her name, this is how you would do it, because it's literally the same. And she didn't realize that till we were in a store one day and she went, oh my God, that's my initials. So I thought that was pretty fun. So this is a nice wine. It's a good little table wine, light wine if you want. It's bright, tropical fruits, crisp, good, nice little wine, easy, affordable drinking. So for our guests here, so this is a screw top. It's not a cork. So can you tell us more about the screw tops?
Screw tops are great. They basically save using a cork for a wine that doesn't really need a cork. So corks, I think, in my world, are more geared toward a wine that'll sit and age. A cork allows a little, percentage of oxygen in and out every couple days, every month, over time, slowly. With a screw cap, it keeps oxygen out and the wine in, and that's really what you want in a white wine and a wine that's meant to consume earlier than aging it, which is a perfect example. This wine's great today. I don't think I would lay this down for 10 years. It doesn't need to. So he's very smart to not put a cork in there and save a couple bucks on his end, save a couple bucks on the consumer end, and still have a very nice wine. And on top of that, it's easy to carry that around. You don't need a corkscrew. You don't need an opener. You can just unscrew it whenever you want, pour it, and close it back up.
So having a screw top doesn't necessarily dictate that it is a lower quality wine or anything?
No, not at all. Not at all. There's some actually really nice wines out there with screw caps. Again, I think it's more about sustainability. And I think that's cool that wine producers are taking that into account. And I know a lot of consumers love the romance and that sound that it makes when you pop open a cork, but a lot of wines don't necessarily need a cork. And there are other options too. There's plastic corks, agglomerate corks that are made out of like little, it looks like a cork board that you put a push pin in. But in general, we try to save corks for bigger reds or bigger wines that are going to be aged, whereas a screw cap is just easy for everybody.
And a lot of wineries in Australia are going to the screw tops primarily. So
yeah,
and they produce great wine.
Yeah, and producers of the actual companies that make these screw caps are starting to experiment with different membranes, so they actually allow a little oxygen in and out. So not only are you saving cork trees, you're still able to age a wine without having to use a cork.
Interesting. That'd be cool technology to see. So thank you for joining us on this episode, Ben, to discuss wine, of course, and some gardening and how that works in the growing process with wine and with agriculture. And if you guys have any questions about gardening, Ben is available. We can always get in touch with him. And of course, when you think of death, think of me. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you found value, please like, subscribe, and share. And be sure to follow me on all the socials at Sips and Tips with Lindsay. And of course, you can always go to my website, sipsandtipswithlindsay.com, to find more information about estate planning, business, snowboard, travel, and of course, wine. As always, we have to get the legal stuff out of the way. I went to law school, so you don't have to. However, we have to read the special disclaimer that I am not a practicing attorney. I am not your attorney. I am not offering any legal advice in any content or any episode. All content is for your information and educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for seeking your own legal advice from your own attorney or other professionals such as a CPA or financial advisor. I cannot give legal advice and do not offer any legal services or legal advice, but I do offer some fun and educational content for you to enjoy.